All right, everyone, snuggle up and get your s'mores ready. This is Jackson Steger, and you're listening to Season 2 of Campfire. Let's get it. This season of Campfire seeks to understand how to build new cities. Each week, we are joined by experts and practitioners from different startup cities who will share the stories and lessons that they have learned from experimenting with radical new models of living. Cabin is building its own network city of co-living neighborhoods, which you can learn more about by visiting creatorcabins.com or by following us at Creator Cabins. Our first location outside of Austin, Texas is now accepting applications for residents, with our other neighborhoods soon to follow. If you're interested in long-term co-living at beautiful locations with nature out the front door, high-speed internet, and actual campfires, plus unlimited sauna use, you can sign up today by visiting cabin.city. Also, let us know if there's a guest that we should have on this show. If you introduce us to a city builder or a neighborhood developer and we book them, we'll reward you with cabin tokens. Today's guest is Patrick Lydon, an author, filmmaker, and urban ecologist who writes the Possible City Substack all the way from South Korea. Possible City is a collection of short stories, photo essays, and other content about solutions for the equitable, ecological cities of the future. Our conversation today is about natural farming, microdiversity in neighborhoods, and how to have diverse forested zones within a community. At the beginning of the episode, you hear us reference a documentary that Patrick directed called Final Straw, Food, Earth, and Happiness. We'll put a link to the abbreviated free 20-minute version of the film in the show notes. Cool. Your marshmallows are probably done roasting. Grab some graham crackers. Let's get on with the episode. Patrick Lydon, welcome to Campfire.
Hi, good to be here, Jackson.
Really excited to talk about how we make cities more equitable, more resilient, more regenerative. And I think that you bring a really fresh perspective to this city building conversation that we haven't really gotten into with past guests yet. But before we go super tactical, would love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you working on, and what's really the thread that ties your life or career together right now?
Yeah. Well, these days, I guess, about 10 years ago, I left Silicon Valley. That's where I grew up, and I worked there in the tech industry for a while. I studied art, but everyone who grows up in that valley kind of ends up doing this stuff, and it was a really interesting experience. But I kind of saw a lot of cracks developing in the way that we're living there in the valley, and that a lot of the solutions we were coming up with there weren't really addressing the problems. And so I got kind of frustrated with all of that, and I decided to go look for answers elsewhere. And long story short, we ended up making the film, which you saw, Final Straw, Food, Earth, Happiness. That project was supposed to just be an interview like this one with a farmer, and it turned into a 4-year project. And through that, we kind of had this huge perspective change as to how we solve problems. And so the basement of where we work from these days is actually from those farmers that we interviewed during the making of that film. And their whole thing is based on if we're going to find a way of living equitably, growing food equitably, having a society that is equitable, not just between people, but between ourselves and the environment, then we need to start by building relationships, just like we would between humans, So that's the basis of our work, is build a relationship with nature where you are first, and start from there. And that can help inform what you do in a good way.
You mentioned that your time in Silicon Valley, you noticed that the approaches that tech was taking weren't solving the important problems. What are those problems that you refer to?
Yeah, it's so funny because these days it was simpler then. And at that time, around 10 years ago, people were just kind of getting on board with, there's all these ecological problems, that was the beginning of kind of this really big push about climate, and not just climate, but realizing all of the ways that we're degrading the environment in in ways that we call it regenerative now. So we are not thinking in a regenerative way. We're just thinking of an extractive way. How much can we take until this thing doesn't have any more to give? And we realize that's not a good way to go. But at the time, 10 years ago, people weren't even talking about that. And that was really frustrating to me, that especially cities weren't like, you know, you got to take care of your own backyard. You have to take care of your own region. You have to figure out how to localize as much stuff so that you have control over your energy. You have control over your food, you know, and those are still kind of getting out of control today. But at least I think people are kind of aware of these issues now. So,
yeah, well, and you know, the awareness is in no small part due to storytellers like yourself who create these media publications that sort of drive certain narratives forward. And one of the things I really liked in the film is you talk about this man named Masanobu Fukuoka. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation.
No, you got it.
A good part of the core message, at least in the version I saw, is that there are certain principles of natural farming that cities might be able to incorporate. And this struck me as like the best example of like a regenerative practice in that film. And so, yeah, for the audience, could you sort of highlight what are those principles of natural farming? What is natural farming? Why is that a good alternative to like other farming? What is even like the current status quo of farming, and why isn't it natural farming?
Sure. You know, people are probably familiar with organic farming in, you know, to a certain extent, right? There's organic food movement has been around for a while. And that's a certification system which has, you know, positive things about it and negative things about it. You can enforce a system that's certified, but you can also distort it and leverage it to the people who kind of hold the power, the bargaining power in any situation. So natural farming is way different than that. It's kind of just a mindset of how you approach a situation. Yeah. So whereas organic farming is like supposed to be this, okay, here's the end result of what we think is going to be good for people in the environment, and here's all these rules to follow. Natural farming is kind of the beginning of that process. And the natural farmers realize that these kind of certification systems don't apply everywhere, because everywhere is different. Every field is different. Every person is different. Even the kind of food you want to eat, or the kind of food that wants to grow in a certain place, is different everywhere. And so natural farming is based on cultivating a relationship with the land where you are, first of all, and making sure that there's dialogue between you and the land, you know, that you're paying attention to what's going on. And there are some rules that Fukuoka and other farmers developed, but they're really loose rules. It's like, you know, rule number 1 is don't till the land, don't dig up the land, because, and that's a big one. And that one's realized in organic farming these days lately too, that when you dig up the soil, you know, the soil is a living thing. There's a whole community of microorganisms and fungal networks, all these things underground that you kind of need to have a healthy soil and to have healthy food and to have this regenerative thing going on. And if you if you dig all that up, which farmers usually do every year, the sun does its job in killing everything that comes up, and all those communities are ripped up and destroyed. It's like if you picture a city underground, and then every year you just go rip up the city and blow up all the buildings and kill all the people in the city, and everyone's running away. I mean, that's the scene on most farms. And so they realize, well, that's probably not a good thing. We want to keep that intact. So that's one big rule.
And I definitely want to hear the other rules too, but like, what's sort of the historic, why did we start plowing or tilling? What made humanity think this was a good idea? What were the incentives pushing us to do that?
You know, you could trace it historically to a few different places, but I would say that it was a change in our mindset as human beings, where hunter gatherers, or what are called proto farmers, who were kind of messing around with farming, but not also doing hunting and thing. I mean, this point in humanity, we still believed that we were part of nature. We still had this understanding that humans are ecological beings. We're different from other beings, but we're ecological. We're part of this ecology. And at some point in human history, and the natural farmers, one of my mentors, Larry Korn, who's from Oregon, he's a soil scientist, and he says right around the time where agriculture started, that's where humans got this idea that we're a separate thing from nature. Like, we're really special. We're up above nature and the rest of nature is below us. And a lot of, people blame that on Descartes, but it happened way before him. Um, Agriculture started a long time ago. And that was the beginning of that separation. So we're masters of nature. And that's actually, we're coming to realize it's not actually true. Yeah.
And so another two examples of things that like are a part of nature, but that humans probably think of themselves as better than, are weeds and insects. So, I'm no fan of mosquitoes. I've definitely seen places that are quick to harvest, or quick to weed their weeds and get rid of them. But one of the other principles of natural farming from the film was that weed and insects are not your enemies. So can you help us understand why they're not our enemies and how can we help make them our friends?
Sure. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that they're your best friend, but it does mean that you're not going to start a war with them, right? So that's the distinction, is they're, you tolerate them because you realize that if, okay, in a monoculture, which most farming is these days, most industrial farming, if you plant all of one thing and create a monoculture, then you got big problems with weeds and with pests, especially. And if you till the soil, it makes it even worse. And one of these rules that from the biological sciences is that biodiversity is super important, right? And it's just like in a human community, diversity is really important, because that creates this strength and this resilience, right? Because there's so many different ways of looking at something and doing something, that you kind of you find your way to move forward in the best way generally. So the monoculture creates these issues with weeds and pests. But if you have a farm where you're growing all sorts of different things, and this is not just natural farming, permaculture does this, agroecology, the thing they call regenerative agriculture looks at this too. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but the idea is if you have really diverse field with lots of stuff going on in it, and that includes weeds, then your field is way less susceptible to having pest invasions, because they can't gain a foothold in your field. Whereas if you're planting all one thing, then, swarms can just come and knock everything out, but it's not possible if you have a diversity of plants in your field. So that's what we see on the natural farms a lot, is they're intercropping a lot of different things, and it creates resilience. And they grow a lot more food per acre than any industrial farm I've ever seen.
Oh, really? Oh, so that kind of leads into my next question. Is I was going to make the assumption that the reason why we industrial farm is because there's just such strong demand for certain crops. So if it is true that we can actually potentially harvest more food through natural farming, then how can we incentivize our cities or our communities to promote more natural farming? What's stopping us right now?
I think the biggest thing, and you kind of just hinted at it by saying demand, is that people don't know all of these different amazing, delicious plants that you can eat. Right? We go to the grocery store and there's like two different, you want a green apple, you want a red apple, you want the white corn, you want the, yellow corn. And there's so much delicious stuff, including weeds, most of which are edible, in those fields. And so if you're talking calories and vitamins and all the things that your body needs, you're going to get a lot more of that per acre or per whatever measurement you're using if you're growing a really diverse set of plants, and weeds. And we go out in the field and we pick weeds when we're on these farms too, and we put them on top of our rice. And so the big point here is people's diet has to change. They have to be aware of all these, and that's just going to take, people being curious and investigating and being better, more creative chefs. And that could lead to, a really amazing culinary scene in the city if we're all like dealing with weeds and all these plants that we normally don't see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm down. I was just recently hearing about seaweed specifically and kind of all of its specific benefits.
Totally.
But like, I guess then that sort of requires this huge societal shift away from some of the perhaps more sugar oriented diets that we have. What if, say we discovered like a new continent? Obviously this is not really a realistic scenario, but let's just say there was a new piece of decently biodiverse land that was fertile, and there's rivers, and we're going to found a new city at some trident of those rivers and kind of start from the beginning. How might you advise those city planners to design the city itself to be integrated with natural farming?
Yeah, I would say even you don't need a brand new place to work with, and it doesn't need to be fertile either, because natural farming methodology will make it fertile over time, because that's what nature does if you know how to help it. Anyway, but the exhibition we're doing now here in Daejeon in Korea kind of looks at this question too, and we recommend a few things. And the first, I guess the most important thing, is to look at the landscape as it is, look at that ecosystem as it is, and very thoughtfully being aware of what's there and how the landscape works and how the water flows and where the plants are and where the animals are. Knowing how this landscape functions and regenerates itself really thoughtfully build your city based on knowledge of what's there already. And we don't do that today. We build cities in the easiest place. And usually that's the farmland. And sometimes that's the floodplain, which causes disasters, especially these days. And so just to be aware and build, I think the best cities are really aware of their environment. They let the rivers flow. They don't mess with the rivers. They don't put them in canals, They know that the water kind of does its thing. There's floodplains. They have to deal with this stuff in order for us to avoid disaster later on. So you know where the water's going, you know where the forests are going. You allow things to be connected, because the environment around the city needs to be connected in order for it to be healthy. These forests have to run all the way from mountain to all the way down to the forest. And we cut off all this stuff and we build highways for ourselves, and then we forget about the highways for all the other animals, which are actually important for the health of the environment. And so just to be aware of, and then to build densely as they used to build cities in Europe. You build your cities densely and closely so that um, they're not using up all this land that we shouldn't be touching, you know. And by densely, I don't mean like 100-floor apartment towers, but you know, you can build a dense, close knit community and be really aware of your space without building skyscrapers too.
Listeners will know that we've talked about this in other episodes, how so much of our space is currently allocated to cars in most big American cities, at least, and how getting rid of all of that space for cars opens up all these other opportunities. You wrote a post on this concept called a pocket farm. So could you just briefly share, like, what is a pocket farm and how might metropolitan residents, so I live in Santa Monica in LA, like how might people like me or someone living in Brooklyn or in Northern Virginia identify spots to create pocket farms?
Yeah. So that's a beautiful place for a pocket farm where you live. By the way, there might even be a few. I'll check. I'll check it out and see if I can. So pocket farm, basically this Scottish biologist slash I'm a polymath. He did so many things. He was an urban planner also, named Patrick Geddes. He had this plan to kind of in these super dense urban kind of slums in Edinburgh at the time. There's like a real problem with getting light to buildings and air circulation, and kind of, you know, it was a little too dense. And so he had idea, well, people need to be connected to nature anyway. So why don't we just put little pockets of nature, and that solves a bunch of problems. It connects us to nature, gives us a place to kind of sit and relax. It helps light and air get in through the cities. And then I think he started to realize that it's not just that, but it started building community. Because a really important point is that the parks in cities today, in the US at least, they're all managed by the city, right? So there's like a maintenance team, and your tax money goes to pay them, and they do their work. But these pocket parks, the idea is that the community who lives there takes care of it together, which forces them to connect and make decisions together and kind of build relationships among each other. So he realized that these things, you know, sometimes there's a garden in it, sometimes it's just trees and other plants. But the point was that people were going there and managing it together. And so there's all these positive things happening just because you put this little garden in there and you gave people the agency that, hey, you're the owner of this space, so you got to take care of it. And when you do that, wow, I mean, it changes totally from if you just plop a city park in the middle of the neighborhood and you're like, oh, here's your park, and you don't have any responsibility for that park. So it's he found that the social element to it was really important.
I have a friend, her name's AJ, who has helped involve me and several of my other friends in this cool community garden project in Venice. A big part of like how I've learned about it is there was like a solstice watching party that like we did at the gardens, and there's this other like buffet potluck day one time, and people brought guitars and there was music. But like any other like tactics for how one might engage the neighborhood and sort of get people out and get them to see, because the scenery of this community garden, it very much looks like what I saw in your film. The sort of it has this almost wild look, but of course it's not wild. Well, it isn't like there's thoughtfulness there, but yeah, how do we do that engagement process? Are there tools out there we should use, or is just this more like, not to make a bad pun, but like a grassroots organizing campaign?
Yeah, I think people need a common goal, right? And then again, as I said, they need agency. And the one of the things that's kind of gone wrong with the political process lately is there is no agency. People don't feel like they have power to change because it's become so big, even in cities, you know. So autonomy is a big word for me. Like and this is kind of just theoretical. It's not a solution, but it's a suggestion
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, but kind of like what you're doing with the campfire. If if cities allowed neighborhoods to have autonomy to make their own decisions about things to a certain extent, that would go a really long way to help people get engaged and to do things that would benefit them. Um, and so I think that's missing. And without that, it's really difficult to get people engaged, in my experience, you know, um, unless they're all interested in gardening in the community garden. That's a good way to do it. But not everyone's interested in
Sure.
doing that, and that's fine. But they need other ways to feel like they can shape the environment around them and like they have some control over that. So,
Appreciate that. I'm going to do a hard transition now into Bomunsan forest protocols, which I may have also pronounced that wrong. But could you explain what a Bomunsan forest protocol is? And then with that, like, what are the benefits of a continuous and diverse forested zone within a city?
sure. Um, the Bomunsan forest protocols, and it's the mountain right outside of it's kind of overlooks the city here, and it means treasure mountain in Korean. So I was inspired by a few writers lately, and one of them is Robin Wall Kimmerer. I don't know if you've heard her name. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is really great. And Diana Beresford Kroger, I think her name. She wrote a book to speak for trees, and they're both scientists, but they both have this ancestral wisdom that they're rooted in before they became a scientist. And so they talk a lot about these themes we've been talking about so far here. And one of them is that the trees have a lot of wisdom held in them because in general they can be way older than humans, right? Like the oldest trees are 2,000 years or more. And in Korea, they have specifically, and that's why we did the project here, they have these trees called Tangsan Namu. And it's a tree that's at the center of a village. And it's a very old tree. Usually it's like a Zelkova or a usually it's a Zelkova or a camphor, uh, depending on the climate. And these old trees are at the center of a village, and they're the guardian tree. And people in the village sit under these guardian trees, and they go there every day, and they just kind of chill out under the tree. And it's kind of their wisdom tree. It's the place where they go to solve problems. It's the place where they go to be thankful. And so I thought, well, that's a good starting point, is that there's a lot of knowledge in the trees. And if you watch the trees and you watch the forest and how the forest is, you come to learn a lot about how things should be, you know, how this super complex system in the mountain built itself and maintains itself. And all of those lessons can be applied in some way to the way we build cities. So that's one thing, is like, if the forest is closer to us, we're closer to that understanding. But also there are tons of scientific studies these days. Like, if you live closer to a forest, you're more likely to live longer. You're less likely to have cancer. Even during the COVID times, they found studies that people living near forests um, had less complications due to COVID. So there are ways in which the forest helps humans be healthier just by being there, which is amazing, you know? Um, and that's not to say, I mean, then there's also all of the ecological things about holding topsoil in and creating fertility and letting the water sink into the soil and doing all these things that are really helpful for cities, especially when like our climate's kind of going crazy and we get these heavy rains and then we get dry seasons. And so the forest helps with all that. And if we don't have them near our cities, then we're kind of screwed, you know?
I'm curious how we might enable that phenomenon to occur much more often. Like you kind of touched on this earlier when we were talking about water flow, but like what does it mean to have a right of way for rivers and streams, and how do we do less manicuring of our cities and instead let nature curate our meadows to the point that we're able to have all of these benefits and have these interconnected forest systems?
This might sound counterproductive, but I think we need to be more lazy. Honestly, I mean, our obsession with productivity these days is ridiculous. And what does most of that productivity go to? You know, it doesn't go to stuff that's helping the environment or helping us continue to live here. If you look at it, you know, so part of that is what the natural farmers found, and people kind of tend to call them lazy farmers, even though they grow tons of food, is that they are super aware of what nature is doing. And when nature's doing something that works, they just let it be. And I call that wisdom, you know, to know when to stop and when you need to kind of chill out and sit back and have a beer and, you know, watch nature do its thing instead of obsessing about how it looks aesthetically. And that's, I mean, I studied design, so that's a big problem for me when I went to these natural farms because they look messy. And I'm super obsessive about like having things be in an order that I understand. But then after a few years, 2 years, 3 years, when you start to know what all the plants are and you start to know what they do and you start to know which ones you can eat, then the order comes in and you're like, oh, yeah, now I can see everything and it is beautiful. But before I knew what's there and before I paid attention, it's not beautiful, you know? So laziness, but also awareness, being, you know, practicing awareness every day, learning all the shit that's around you and what it's called and what it does. You know, we don't do that hardly at all these days. So.
Well, speaking of shit, could our cities one day be powered by poop?
It is useful. It is
How so?
useful.
Like,
Kobe, Kobe City, a lot of cities actually, but I visited the sewage treatment plant in Kobe. And they extract so like everything they possibly can out of the shit that comes and the wastewater that comes from the city. And I talked to one of the engineers and she said, yeah, our job, like on paper, our job is to clean the water just enough so that we can release it into the ocean, into the stream. And she said, but that's like a really boring job. Like who wants that job? Oh, I clean shit water. And so the engineers at this facility kind of just started being creative and figuring out, okay, what's all the stuff that's in this wastewater and how can we use it? And so they pump natural gas into the city gas pipelines directly from the anaerobic digesters that digest the sewage. So they make gas, they heat their plant, they make power for the plant with the gas, and they give fertilizer to farmers, which is the leftover stuff after all these processes have happened. They make bricks, that paved the city. So it's crazy. Like when you have this obsession to kind of, okay, we're going to try to be as, use as much of these resources as possible so that nothing goes to waste. That's the mindset. And I think that comes from, in Japan at least, from this historical mindset of the Japanese people. And there's another really good book about Edo period Japan called Just Enough: Lessons in Green Living from Edo or something. And Edo is the time period
Tokyo.
before Tokyo and before kind of the borders were opened. And Tokyo, which was Edo, called Edo at the time, they were the biggest city in the world, over 1 million people. The borders were totally closed, almost totally closed to anything coming in or going out. And they had a super sustainable society with a mega city. And it was because they looked at everything flowing out of the city in terms of waste, and they used all of it. All of the crap was, people paid to take crap out of the city, and then they brought it to farmers and sold it to the farmers. So there's an economy going on there. No one wasted anything. Everything was made out of materials that could be recycled and or rebuilt into something else. And when they're finally done, it becomes, firewood, or it goes into a compost pile or something. So it was incredible. Like, that can be done. It was done. And Edo was not a, medieval city that was super difficult to live in. It was a really alive, vibrant city. So the lessons are there. We just need to, I don't know, look into it and have the drive to do it and be excited to do it. I'm excited to do it.
I'm excited too, and kind of my takeaway from this whole episode is there's a lot of shit that we need to reimagine to know how we can be more resilient and create cities that do have these regenerative traits. Patrick, thanks so much for joining. Where would you like to direct folks who want to learn more about what you write about and learn about? What's the call to action that you want to have for them?
Sure. I mean, our website is City as Nature. That's our studio. cityasnature.org. Or also the Possible City at Substack. It's a weekly newsletter you can sign up for if you want to join in these kind of adventures, these shitty adventures, or otherwise interesting adventures on different takes on what's possible in our cities.
Great. Thank you so much for joining, Patrick. I really enjoyed it.
Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Jackson.